In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the overall flow of argument that we find in Romans chapters 1 through 4. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, the theme of chapters 1 through 4 is God's righteousness. Now, we often think of God's righteousness as His moral holiness. That His righteousness is His moral perfection of which we as human beings fall short. And certainly God's righteousness is that. But the word righteousness in Greek actually has a broader frame and field of meaning than just God's moral absolutes. In fact, sometimes the word righteousness refers to God's justice. So, for instance, when Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled," many scholars believe that's a reference to those who hunger and thirst for justice in this world, for things being put right. Also, a case can be made that the word righteousness likewise includes God's commitment to keep His promises, in a sense, God's integrity, or God's faithful reliability. I think all of these themes regarding righteousness come into play in the book of Romans. Now, let's talk a little bit about how Paul develops this idea. After introducing himself to the church in Rome and telling them that he is planning to visit, Paul begins to describe the scope of God's wrath against sin in chapters 1, verses 18 through 32. The nature of God's wrath in these verses is not God pouring down fire from heaven or judgment or earthquakes or these kinds of things. But in this section where God describes His wrath towards humanity's rejection of God and their worship of things in creation, 3 times, Paul says, God gave them over. He says it in verse 24, verse 26, and again in verse 28. What this tells us is that God's wrath, or His resistance, or His judgment against sin, at least in this time period that we live in now, in light of the coming of Jesus, that wrath is manifested in God allowing people to go their own way. Not in the pouring out of fire from heaven, but that God gives them over. And he concludes this statement, or this argument, by saying that all humans are without excuse. So let's talk a little bit about how Paul develops this argument. He says the root of God's judgment against the human race, of God's wrath, is our rejection of God as our Creator. We might think of that as the roots of God's judgment, that all humans have rejected God as their Creator. And that as a result of this rejection of God as our Creator, this has led human beings, the human race, to become captive to their own desires. That rejection of God's place in our life leads to captivity, to unrestrained desires. And that this leads us to behavior that goes against God's plan for the human race. That our rejection of God leads to us being captive to our own desires, which leads us to behavior that goes against God's desires, God's norms for human flourishing, and that this creates a society that is characterized by moral chaos. So you might think of the moral chaos as the fruit of the root, which was human rejection of God and God's role in our lives. That the moral chaos of society comes from a rejection of God as Creator, which leads to unrestrained desires, which leads us to be drawn to behaviors, ways of living that are outside the character boundaries of God, which leads to moral chaos in society. This is really his explanation for the chaos that characterized pagan Roman society, which is really what he's taking aim at in chapters 1, verses 18 through 30. But of course, Jewish people who are reading this would say, well, what about us? And in chapter 2, Paul begins to address the Jewish person who has God's law, who presumably was part of God's solution to moral chaos. And in chapter 2 of Romans, Paul begins to address the Jewish mind and perhaps the Roman moralist as well, to show that even these people that perhaps aren't as captive to their own unrestrained desires, but that they too are part of the problem. That they too, even in their condemnation of moral chaos and moral depravity that happens in society, they themselves are guilty of the very things that they are condemning. That in fact, when he gets to chapter 3, he comes to the conclusion that all have sinned. That this is a problem for the entire human race. Not just those that were living in the moral chaos of Greco-Roman society, but even for those, quote, moral people that were condemning that moral chaos, that they themselves were guilty as well. That in fact, no one has escaped the indictment of the early chapters of Romans. And in fact, all have sinned, and therefore all are in equal need of God's solution. One way to think of it that N.T. Wright describes is that society and the human race, apart from God, lives in their rejection of God in moral chaos and captive to their desires. And therefore, in order to address that problem, in order to bring a solution to it, God called the people of Israel to be a light, to call people back to worship of the one true God. But in fact, what God intended to be a solution, the people of Israel, actually became part of the problem. Israel got swept up in the same sin problem the rest of the human race got swept up into. And so, in fact, Israel became a part of the problem. And in the sending of Jesus and the gospel, the message of Jesus, Paul is calling both Israel, intended to be the solution, but having become part of the problem, and the rest of the human race. That the coming of Jesus solves the original problem of the human race's captivity to sin, and the secondary problem of Israel becoming part of that problem. That Jesus, in fact, answers both dilemmas. Now, part of what this tells us is that the entire human race is without excuse. And in fact, I think this passage, or this line of argument in Romans chapters 1, 2, and 3, is a powerful statement to us about how we should view the moral failures of other people. You see, the church can often be incredibly judgmental and arrogant. And it's not that we shouldn't call moral failure for what it is. But when we do so in an attitude of superiority, a kind of judgmentalism, we fall into the condemnation of chapter 2. This judgmental attitude that often characterizes the church towards those outside of the church lulls us into a false sense of security. It blinds us to our own faults as well. And all we see are the failures of those outside the church, and we become blinded to our own failures. And so it blinds us to our own faults. And it in fact usurps God's role as the only one truly in a position to judge.